while we're getting seated, can you just tell them what that book was? But first of all, I forgot to welcome Andy also. I think we should just describe that book, which we did a fantastic event about. What was this, before we get on to crossing?
So this is the book that came out of my project in 2012 to read a book from every country in the world in a year. And it became something of an international endeavour. People all over the world got involved, sent me suggestions, sent me books, and in some cases wrote and translated things for me. It took on a life of its own, and more than 10 years later, I still receive messages almost every day from people around the world about books and stories and what stories mean to them, and all kinds of different things connected to that. And it's been a life-changing endeavour. This book isn't the story of the quest, that's on the blog, which I kept while I was doing the project, but this is a series of kind of interlinked, I suppose, that it tells the story a little bit, but it's exploring the big issues that came out of the quest. So the role of censorship, how stories connect us, how translation works, and various different encounters that I had during that year and since are worked into it. But yeah, it's really about how stories can bring us together across cultural, political, social, biographical, geographical boundaries. And I think for me, what that question uncovered was the extraordinary power of stories to unite us, and at a time when we're facing so much division and difficulty in the world. I think that's something that is really inspiring, and if we can find the right way to harness that, it gives us great hope for the future. And it's something that I think has fed into all my subsequent writing, my fiction writing, my first novel, Beside Myself, to a certain extent, crossing over very much more so, that idea of storytelling connecting us, and how far we can go to understand one another, and the barriers and the ways we can find around that.
And people can see the TED Talk.
Yes.
And you had people writing to you from Afghanistan about their reading habits.
Yes,
and God knows
yeah. Well,
what.
in fact, when we did that event back late last year, I'd had an extraordinary email about half an hour before I came here. So I'll keep it as short as I can. But essentially, I'd had an interaction with a schoolboy some years prior over email. He'd emailed me and said he'd heard of my project and he loved the idea of reading books from different countries. But there was a problem. He lived in Afghanistan, and there were no English language bookshops where he was, and Amazon didn't deliver there. So how was he going to get books? He said he'd learnt to read in English because his father had read him the Dr. Seuss books when he was a child. And so because I liked his courage and his enthusiasm, I actually organised a box of books to go to him. And it took some doing, and this was before we pulled out of Afghanistan, but even in those days, arranging a courier to take books to a village near Kabul was no mean feat, but I managed it, and I got an email eventually saying that these books had arrived, and then he sent me this extraordinary email a few days later saying that he'd read the first book in the box, which was Broken April by the Albanian writer Ismail Kadare, and that he'd been totally blown away by it. That he said that although it was fiction set in a different part of the world, this story about the blood feuds in northern Albania, where one person is killed and then it's the duty of the oldest male in the family to avenge that death, and then the duty of the oldest male in that family to avenge that death, and onwards and onwards. This story had felt to him as though it was about his own village, and he recognised the menace and the terror in the pages all too well, and it made him want to write about his village. And we exchanged a few more emails, and then the trail went cold. I heard nothing more. And then the night I was coming here to talk about the new edition of the book, I received an email from him. He's in the US now, studying a master's in literature, and wanting to be a writer. And he said that Tolstoy had made him fall in love with his life, even the mad bits, that he'd been through hell in the subsequent years, but with Tolstoy he had faith. And we had a Zoom call actually a few months after that, not that long ago, where we chatted, and he's going to send me some of his writing when he's ready to do so. So that's just one example of the many extraordinary interactions that I've been fortunate to have through this project, that really started as a naive individual personal quest to correct a blind spot in my reading, because I realised my reading was very narrow, and suddenly opened up this whole world to me.
we're going to get the publisher, Extraordinary Renard Press, to say a quick word, because Will is here from London, and the reason we're going to do that is because it's wonderful to support independent publishers, and also he's just got an award, hasn't he? The Independent Publishers Guild Award, which is fantastic, so he won't take up long of our time. He used to work for OR Books, that's correct, isn't it?
Alma Books.
And OR Books.
Anyway, yeah.
And they're publishing, I think, Henry's book,
All Books.
The Song of
The Taliban.
the Taliban, which is about an Afghan refugee. So serendipitously, the man is here who knows probably more about why we have a refugee crisis than many people on the planet. I'll save your blushes, which is Patrick Coburn, the journalist, is here, and his son Henry's written this book, which we're going to do a talk for when it comes out. So that was All Books, another one, fine independent publisher. Alma was another one, but now you own your own publisher. So I'd like you to say a few words, or do you want to?
Well,
I'll stand up because it feels a bit
Yeah,
weird
come on,
addressing
Will.
you from there.
Yeah, it does. Come up to the altar.
Well, you're not really here to listen to me, so I'll keep it very short. But it's just, thank you so much for having us here in this brilliant bookshop, huge
Thanks for coming.
bookshop. Yeah, and everyone for coming and supporting the book. It's really a delight to see it here in the flesh. I know it's been a long journey for you, starting with Audible and crossed my desk for the first time 2 years ago, almost to the day. So it feels like it's been quite a time getting here, and it's just such a fantastic book. It was great listening to you just then talking about how your projects tie together and how they inform one another. And I think it really comes through. So many people have said such wonderful things. You can read some of them inside the book, but this sense of humanity, empathy, understanding one another or not, and being okay with that, I think is really the heart of it. And while it's a fantastic story you'll enjoy, I think it's a real force for good, which is brilliant to be putting out in the world. So thank you for trusting little Renard to bring it out, and thanks for having us.
And you're a climate positive publisher as well, aren't you? You said it's printed by not in Guangdong, but in publisher in Gloucester.
In Gloucester, yeah.
So in every way it's ecologically friendly, which not a lot of publishers are.
Yeah, but I think hopefully there'll be more and more of that going on.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good, so crossing over this wonderful book, which passed for me the test I always have where the light goes on in the lavatory and I'm finishing it and I have to wave my arms around. Too much information. You wrote it before, didn't you? And you changed it since. Can you outline that?
So I wrote this book 6 years ago, shortly after I moved to Folkestone, and there were a number of inspirations for it, but I'd always wanted to write about the little ships Dunkirk crossing, which was a story I'd heard over the years, on and on. My family, part of my family were from Kent, and my grandfather was involved with work at Dover Castle, and I'd heard about the little ships, and I'd always found it a very moving story, but I also suspected it had been somewhat idolised in the national imagination. And when I moved to Folkestone, I started to hear stories of people making crossings from France to the UK in small boats. I mean, mostly at that time, actually, they were crossing in lorries. There were very few little boats in the channel, but it seemed clear to me that this was going to become a more frequent occurrence. At that time, we were hearing lots of stories from the Mediterranean, the small boats there and the disasters that were happening. But it seemed to me that this had to be on its way. And so what I wrote was a partly speculative, really, story about what would it be like when this becomes more frequent, bringing together those two crossings. And I knew that to do that, I would need a character who could sort of access those different kinds of experience. So I needed someone who had some connection to the Dunkirk crossing, to the little ships, and someone who had a connection to the small boats. So that gave me Edie, who is 87, and is beginning to lose her memory through dementia, and it gave me Jonah, who is someone from Malawi who came on a small boat to the UK. The reason that I made Jonah come from Malawi was because at the time when I wrote the book first, there was a big distinction being drawn in the press between economic migrants and refugees. We were being told at the time that refugees were welcome, but economic migrants were not, and that they would just be sent home. Now, of course, nobody's welcome. Everybody is being treated with suspicion. But at the time when I wrote the book, I was very conscious of this distinction, and I wanted to challenge it because I found it very problematic. I thought it was dangerous to draw this line, and difficult to do so, because many of the people who were coming from countries where they'd been living with extreme poverty had gone through many challenges that were equivalent to some of the trauma that was experienced by people from war zones. But it also seemed to me that challenging the idea that human beings shouldn't be free to move, as we've always done all over the world, was a hiding to nothing, was nonsense, and could only end in suffering and pain. So I decided to have someone who was nominally an economic migrant, although, as Caroline Brothers said when you responded to the wonderful author Caroline Brothers, gave a beautiful response to the novel and said that he was a climate migrant, which he is actually. But essentially, that was my thinking. So I made Jonah the son of a farmer whose family had been devastated by the 2002 famine in Malawi, and the fallout from this was the reason why Jonah eventually decided to make the journey to the UK. However, in the years since, with the way the story shifted, and also with some discussion that's happened around representation in fiction, the way we represent African characters in British fiction, I decided that I wanted to change Jonah slightly. I wanted to do more to challenge the stereotypes that we so often see of sort of victim narratives and helpless people coming out of Africa. I didn't want that to be Jonah, and so I decided to change his circumstances somewhat. For the print edition, the Audible version had him as the son of the farmer. The print edition had him the son of a clinical officer. He's essentially a doctor, someone who has slightly less medical training than a fully qualified doctor, but in many parts of rural Malawi they are the doctors. They perform some operations and they are the first line of healthcare. And so essentially Jonah had come from a relatively educated and relatively, at least initially, affluent family, but they had been caught up in this disaster. And so his prospects were initially at least good, but he still found himself pressed into this need to make this journey, and feeling that was the right thing for him. So that was why I made that shift. And it felt like the right choice.
And the book is his colliding with Edie and getting into her barn. And Edie has her own descent, doesn't she? And you say you tell that through her voice. And where did you? Because I've never read that before in a book. Were there books that triggered that ability to really give what it's like to? I know you shouldn't say it, but go a bit gaga.
Yeah, I mean, over the course of the novel, so Edie has vascular dementia, which is a kind of dementia that happens in stages, in steps, because you have a series of tiny strokes, and so you see a marked shift in someone's cognitive ability, with the kind of fogs of confusion and then more lucid moments that tend to characterise dementia. I had first-hand experience of seeing close relatives with dementia. Two of my grandparents had it before they died for some years. So I'd observed it from the outside. But a book, and I read a number of books. I mean, Elizabeth is Missing is I don't know if you've read that. Well, that's a depiction of someone grappling with a crime that was committed years before, but through a brain that is slowly sort of succumbing to dementia. But for me, actually, the most powerful book, and one that I've read several times, and read first several years ago. In fact, my first novel, Beside Myself, features a minor character with dementia, and I think the seeds of Edie were there. Is John Bailey's Iris memoir, which the beautiful, it's not inside her voice, but it's a beautiful depiction of someone going through this cruel condition. And I love to play with language in my work. It's something that I'm fascinated by different kinds of Englishes, and this is something that Reading the World really opened my eyes to, the many different kinds of Englishes there are, the different kinds of Englishes that we all speak at different points in our day and with different people, and how those different Englishes collide. And so I wanted Edie's English to, and that's reflected, so Edie's condition is reflected in her language, because even from the start of the novel she's misusing words or has gaps in her speaking, and she's constantly fumbling for the right term or something that sounds close enough. And in fact, there's a reading that I may do a bit later that demonstrates this a little bit. And actually, I realised that bringing her together with Jonah, who speaks fluent English, but it's a learned English that he's learned at school, and he's very conscious that his grasp of British idioms may not be quite there, that he may miss certain things. There may be things that he misunderstands. So they're both people who are frightened that they're not understanding correctly or they're getting things wrong. And in many situations in their lives, that proves really difficult because people treat them, they're patronising to them. Edie is constantly worried that she's losing her dignity, that people are, that they're going to find her out as failing. And Jonah has had constant experiences during his journey of being belittled and threatened. But when they come together, because they both doubt that they're getting the right end of the stick, that they're understanding, they actually give each other the benefit of the doubt. So when Edie says something that misuses a word, Jonah assumes it's just an expression he doesn't know.
Yeah.
And when Jonah says something that doesn't perhaps quite correspond with Edie's English, she assumes she's missed, that something in her brain that she's desperately trying to hide, this failing, it is missing what he's saying. So they both accord each other the respect, the dignity of being in the right, and that is what creates the space for their relationship.
Too. She's got that sort of sharpness as well, like irritation with U3A people on coach trips.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. This is an intelligent woman, and that's part of her tragedy, is that her mind is something that has been precious to her, and as it's precious to all of us. But I think she's a sharp, witty person, and seeing someone like that falling apart.
The relationship's great. I mean, even as late as page 82, I think he's thinking of nicking her money. Did you dream about them when you were writing it?
Did I dream? I don't know if I dreamed of. I wrote it in a very intense, short window. The first draft. I mean, it's had multiple a lot of work, redoing bits and adding bits. But the first draft was written in a very intense burst. Sort of a bit like Lucy Calderwell's novel these days, which I remember you said was written in a very intense burst in lockdown. It was a couple of months of writing about 20,000 words a week.
Wow.
When I was pregnant with the baby, not that baby, in fact another baby who's in Folkestone, a baby who's now nearly 6, and I was thinking, oh, she's going to be born, and I want to finish this before she comes, and so I was very intensely writing this novel. So I suppose I lived with it I did very little else other than writing this novel, and so I lived with it very intensely during that time.
The prose, there's one sentence I want to read. Someone is spooked as an ox taking fright at a familiar object, unexpected in its path. I think that's great. Mm-hmm. You must have enjoyed those, and lots of the reviewers have talked about your prose. Do you construct that sort of stuff, or do you suddenly?
I like to. So when I'm writing, so in this book, the narratives, the two storylines, they're not in the characters' voices. They're not first person, but they're a very close third person that's inflected with each character's perspectives, concerns, worldview, and I like, when I write like that, I like to make sure that as far as possible all the imagery reflects their world experience. So the ox, that's from Jonah's home, the oxes are used in the field, so that would be a metaphor that he might reach for. I try always to have, I don't always manage it, but I try to have similes and metaphors that would be what they would reach for in their world through their life experience. Yeah.
And they're both victims of sort of village small-mindedness, would you say, at points?
Yeah. I think that's. I mean, this whole crossing over idea that on the surface they have little in common, and yet actually there is more in common than you might think, and it becomes evident, if not to one another, it becomes evident to the reader over the course of the book. Village small-mindedness. So. Some of it may be in Edie's mind, her fear of being found out, maybe partly her own perspective, and maybe not entirely fair to all of the people in the village. But she's worried that they're going to make decisions for her and take away her agency. That in trying to address her dementia, they will treat her as a problem rather than as a person. And Jonah, he comes from a place where it's hard to look further than the boundaries of the village, I think, and people, because they are so consumed with needing to survive a lot of the time, don't look much further than that. And many of the people there are quite happy with this is what I'm doing, and I'm not going to question, and I'm not going to challenge some of the problems that are keeping many of the things that are not ideal here.
Yeah.
Going.
So she doesn't want to be committed to a home, does she? And
That's right. That's
he
her
obviously
fear.
doesn't want to be arrested.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you been shocked by the mixture in Kent where you live of people who are hostile to refugees and people who do things like this charity you're involved with?
Yeah. Yes, and that's well said, because I was going to mention that. So
there's a pile of these on the till.
we're going to take. If anyone would like to give any money, obviously you may have used up all your pennies buying the book, but if you would like to give some money, there are a couple of charities that I've been working with for several years. The Napier Drop-In, whose director Sally is here tonight. This is a drop-in, wonderful drop-in, and Yvonne, who also works for Samfire, who is heavily involved with the drop-in. And the drop-in is run for the men housed in Napier Barracks in Folkestone. You may have heard about it. It's a place where they can go once a week to be somewhere different, to be among friends, to receive advice, to have fun, and to decompress a bit, really, and just get a change of scene. And it's a really wonderful place, and I have been fortunate, thanks to the support of the Royal Literary Fund, to run a monthly story group there, where I go and work through a famous, usually well-known folk tale or fairy tale or fable of some kind with them, and through playing with it and being silly. I'm very silly when I do this. We have fun, and we kind of learn a bit more about each other and use English skills and things. But Samfire is one of the charities behind the drop-in as well. But we're going to take a collection and divide the money between Cran and the drop-in. So if you would like to, Martin has a dish behind the.
We have a dish. We're having a fundraising night with Cran in November, which we're planning with hopefully people like Chettenham and McCann will bring food along, and we'll have music, which is always important.
Very important.
I kept thinking of Magwitch.
Magwitch. Oh yes.
You know, that initial
yes.
meeting.
Yes, on the marsh.
And that uneasy, and they've both got a commonality of interests in a way.
Yeah, that's a
Another
nice comparison.
Kentish
That hadn't occurred to
thing.
me. But do you know, when I first moved, in fact, when I wrote Crossing Over, I was living in a flat on the Bale in Folkestone, the same road that Charles Dickens lived on when he wrote Little Dorrit. So not great expectations, but I was when I was feeling sort of a bit depressed about how it was going, I would walk past his house and think, well, he could see pretty much the same view as I can see from my window. I want to channel that a little bit.
And he almost had some refugee experiences. I'll throw it open in a minute, but the idea of the time slips and slipping into the back of the time is those time slip things where she remembers the war and he keeps slipping back to his youth in Malawi. They're quite comforting to read, I found, although one comes out of dementia, the other out of distress. Were you aware of that writing it?
Yeah,
Because we've all got those, you know.
Yeah, the past it can be somewhere comforting, although both of them have upsetting things that have happened in their past. It can. I enjoy is perhaps the wrong word, but they felt quite natural to write those sections. I enjoyed that about it. And I mean, one of the reasons that Edie and Jonah can have this strange relationship, this kind of closeness, other than the kind of mutual benefit of the doubt that they give each other, is that for some of the time Edie thinks that Jonah is someone from her past, someone she was in love with during World War II, and so she knows sometimes that he isn't, but that allows a sort of affection, I think, from her side, that he sweetly kind of allows, it doesn't challenge. I think that's the thing. It's I thought quite a lot actually as I was writing this about the various projects there have been, showing what can be done if someone has dementia and they have a particular impression that someone is their mother or whatever, that if you just allow that rather than saying, oh no, don't be silly, your mother's dead or whatever, actually just allowing people to live with the impressions that they have. And there are various projects, some villages even, I think in the Netherlands there's been a project where a village has been created recreating how a village would have been when many of the people living there were children, and they go to the sweet shop as they would have done 70 years ago or whatever, and they're allowed to live in this past, and it's a refuge really, when the present is so frightening and disjointed.
My last question is about your childhood comfort book and how you got into this interest, which has been a sort of lifelong thing for you almost.
Yes.
It seems in your creative career, this world consciousness that.
I think the world consciousness is a strange thing, because when I look back, yes, it was something that I've always. I mean, when I left university, one of my supervisors said to me, "Are you interested in staying on and doing some postgraduate study?"
Was that here or?
That was at Cambridge, and and I said no. My answer was no. There's too much world out there, and it took me another 10 years to find out what that meant, really. I think, but I know that because I should say, so Martin's book, The Bookseller's Tale, one of the central theses of this, it's such a lovely book, is that someone's childhood book, favourite book, will sort of reveal.
And they've often never told anyone.
Yeah.
And it amusingly predicates their adult life.
Yeah, and it's a lovely idea. And my favourite book, and in fact my oldest daughter Cordelia is named partly because of it, was Anne of Green Gables. And Anne of Green Gables wanted to be called Cordelia. So poor Cordelia is called Cordelia because that's what Anne of Green Gables
She could have grown
into
Edie.
She could have done. But I suppose Anne of Green Gables was in love with the imagination and storytelling, and I suppose it's international in the sense that it's a Canadian book rather than a British book. Although I did go to Prince Edward Island, and I went to her house, and I actually couldn't bring myself to go in. It was a choir. We were on Ollie, a dear friend of mine from university. We were both in the same choir as students, and we went on this choir tour to Canada, and we went to Prince Edward Island. And we went to the house that's supposed to be Anne of Green Gables' house, and there were a huge number of particularly Japanese tourists, because Anne of Green Gables is massive in Japan, and they were all wearing orange wigs, or many of them were wearing orange wigs. Apparently this is like a huge phenomenon in Japan.
I knew Lotus Potter was, but...
Yeah, no, it's an eye-opener, but I actually couldn't bring myself to go into this house that had been mocked up to be Anne of Green Gables' house, and I can't allow that. So I waited outside while the rest of the choir went in.
Well, are there any questions about either this book, Refugees, what you're doing in Folkestone, why you left London, from anyone? Thank you very much. Any questions? Comments?
If you like, I can read a little bit actually, because I'd quite, if you don't mind, Martin, because I'd actually quite liked it. I've not done a reading yet, and I quite enjoy reading. So I might have a bit in mind that I hope.
And everyone can hear, can't they?
Yeah, is it loud enough? I hope this demonstrates what I was saying about Edie's grip on language slipping. This is from early in the book, as you can see, and it's when so the book is set in 2015, although it's a kind of not quite real 2015, because I was obviously writing it not knowing quite how this was all going to play out, but nominally it's 2015, and the postman has just arrived. "No need to get up," says the man, barging into the room. "I can see you're busy. Writing your memoirs, are you?" Their eyes converge on the notebook, which is flipped closed on the table between them, revealing its pink floral cover. She wants to reach out and snatch it from view, but the spindrift of a question is in the air, and she can't think how she should respond. In a blast of scared, it comes to her that she has no idea who he is, this man standing in her kitchen, and she grips the back of her chair, barely holding in a scream. "Terrible news this morning," continues the fellow companionably, reaching up to adjust his glasses. 3 drowned off Headley Point. She says, eyes frisking him for clues. He is wearing some sort of uniform. Is it a uniform? That blue shirt and those trousers, the bag with the strap going across his chest. A telegram boy, could it be? Bicycling around the countryside, dispensing bad news with a wink and a wave. But no, there is something wrong with this notion. Her brain throbs, and she puts a hand to her forehead to try to soothe it. Oh dear. "You wonder why they do it," the man is saying. "Risk everything in those flimsy boats with the waves in the channel being what they are. Chances are they'll only be sent straight back where they came from if they do manage to make it across." He looks at her expectantly. She casts about in her mind, fumbling for a suitable card to play. "Just goes to show," she ventures. He nods and points a finger at her. It most certainly does, she expels with relief. But the test is not over. Now the man is looking out of the door at the section of field visible beyond the track where someone has seen fit to dig a big, ugly trench in the earth. Made a start, I see, he says. Must be noisy for you. She narrows her eyes, suspecting a trap. Hasn't she heard this somewhere before? I shall be quite adequate, thank you. Don't you worry about me. The man nods. Well, I won't keep you. I just brought this. He says, placing an envelope on the table next to the jotter. With a surge of relief, she remembers exactly who he is. The realization makes her jut her chin and harden her voice. All right, thank you, Roger. You've delivered your message. You can go now. He laughs. Ha! Roger, that's a good one. You're thinking of Grandad, that's what you're doing. I'm not Roger, I'm Dave. Same eyebrows, 60 years difference. She blinks. Yes, of course, that's what I meant, Dave. He seems to accept this and nods at the table. Red letter day, is it? She looks at the envelope, a crisp cream affair written out in a swirling hand. It is not red. She frowns. The suspicion blows into her mind that he might be being impertinent, alluding to something indecent. She wouldn't put it past him, coming from such a family. I shouldn't expect so, she says, with as much haughtiness as she can muster. It seems to do the trick. Righto, best be off. He turns and makes for the door. She slumps a little in relief. Good riddance. They are so uncouth, these telegram boys, coming into one's kitchen without so much as a by your leave, not even pausing to wipe their feet. Really, she ought to write to the MP about it. She ought to get him to urge Churchill to draft a law enforcing better conduct from such types. Or no, not Churchill, silly. Harold Wilson.
Any questions? Yeah.
Did you manage to get to Malawi, or do you plan to go? Because the writing's so vivid. You must have spent time there. How did you do it?
I did go to Malawi many years before I knew I was going to write a character from Malawi. I spent some time there. It was not a long time, but Steve, my other half, he appeared briefly with a baby and he's disappeared again. He's taking one for the team tonight. He was working out there for a couple of months on a project, and I went and stayed and met a number of Malawians during that time, and it was a project he was working on that brought together actors from Malawi, Zimbabwe, South Africa and the UK, and so we met a lot of people some of whom we stayed in touch with, and I was very fortunate to have a number of people I could ask questions to. It's particularly mentioned in the acknowledgements an amazing man called Ben Mankamba, who is a musician who for many years worked in the UK and travelled the world, but his father was a chief of a village back in Malawi, and his father died, and they said to Ben, will you come back and take over the responsibility? And there, being the chief is you're sort of the law for that region, really. You're in charge of settling disputes, your word goes. And he decided to take the responsibility on, and he went back, and he now runs several amazing projects to try and help people understand more about rural Malawi, and he has a sort of place where people can come and stay and experience life in a Malawian village. But he was a great support. He was on WhatsApp. I was sending him all these questions, and when the audiobook was recorded, Adjua Ando needed various pronunciations explained, and he was voice noting how to say various things. So I was very fortunate to have that kind of first-hand experience, but also those people who I could ask about things. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yes.
Could we hear a little from Jonah?
From Jonah, gosh, I
Yes.
have to think. I have to think what's good to read. Oh yes. Now where is that bit? Yes, I just have to. I know exactly the bit I want to read. I know what I'm going to do. I'll search for it on my Kindle,
Good idea.
and then I can find it rather than keeping it sitting there. I should say while I'm searching that there are so many people I should thank, and thank yous are quite boring to listen to, so I won't name everyone, but all the most important people are mentioned in the acknowledgements, and there are also several people here who've supported the book, several writers, Caroline and Lucy particularly, and Laura as well. Thank you for your support. As Laura and I are part of a very select writing group. We meet at the Curious Brewery in Ashford and share our woes and triumphs and things, and it's a great support. So thank you. And also, Will, you've been wonderful. It's been a real joy working with you. So thank you for that, and thank you, Martin, for having me tonight.
I'd like to mention Ian is here, who's another Kent-based independent
Yes.
publisher, and Caroline Lamarche's event is on the leaflet, and we've done some great events with you. And you publish. What's your MO as a publisher?
So the
International
name is
fiction?
Eloise Press, and it's literary fiction by women only and about women's stories. So our next event is on the 18th of May. She's a writer from Belgium, and the book received a PEN Award. So it's really interesting, very short, so easy to read. And you are all very welcome.
You've
They're
been so
they're
brave.
beautiful books.
Your publisher's been so brave, just launching like, well, I couldn't do it. How do you run a publisher, for God's sake? It's fantastic. Working from a road up here in Canterbury.
More or less, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're
And so
wonderful,
we've got the awards.
wonderful books. I mean, I've been
Yeah.
fortunate to read several of them, and I did an event with
Yes.
one of your authors, and it's absolutely fantastic to see this work being done, because women in translation are so underrepresented. Certainly, when I did my project, 70% of the books that were published in translation were written by men, and so it's a massive imbalance. And so it's wonderful to see people like Aina really working.
Also, I
with
think the
it.
first was we had a third author here on Zoom, didn't we, on a screen?
Oh, that's right, the
Somewhere.
translator. The translator.
Where
Oh,
was
poor thing.
Where was the translator?
She was in
Estonia.
Estonia.
Yes.
Yeah,
She was in
but
Estonia,
she
so
doesn't
that-
live there. She was just there on holiday. Oh,
She-
there for
yeah,
it's
she was
complicated.
Anyway,
Yeah.
come to Caroline Lamarche as well, where there'll
Yeah.
be wine will flow, and it will be 1 hour out of your life.
Okay, right. I found the bit I wanted. So this is as I say, it's not in Jonah's voice, but it's over his shoulder, I suppose, a bit like
thank you.
Evie's. Okay. He is, dare he believe it, in England. Yes, he is almost convinced that this time the urgings of his brain are true. In which case everything has changed, and he ought to call Amai right away and report the happy news that he has made it, that he is well, that her boy, her clever boy, has succeeded and will shortly be tasting the success that England vouchsafes to all those who come to her shores with a genuine appetite to work for their own betterment, particularly people like him. For he is not just another immigrant, way. He is an English speaker and a citizen of a Commonwealth country. That means he is streets ahead of all those he saw hunched over English phrase books in the camps. Although he is pretty sure Gilbert was joking when he said that his name is on a list kept by the Queen in Buckingham Palace. The boy is given to exaggeration now and then. It seems logical that he will get preferential treatment. How could it be otherwise? After all, his nation is linked to the United Kingdom by history. That has to count for something. Otherwise, what is the point of international agreements and the portrait of Her Royal Highness Princess Anne that Abambo used to pass whenever he went into the district hospital to perform caesarean sections, and dignitaries flying back and forth to deliver impressive speeches? Yes, he is surely on his way now.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Yeah, I have a technical question, Anne, which is one of the delights of the book is the joy of language and the way that each of the characters is written. You know, even though the book has a lot of traumatic material, a lot of dark material, it's a joy to read because of the precision with which you write each of them, and they're so distinctive voices. And I wondered, you know, as you've said, you wrote it in the first bit of it really intensely. Did you write each of the characters, each of their voices, and splice them together, or how did you manage the forward momentum of the novel and the points at which their stories needed to coincide? Did you find it easy to flip back and forth between them once you got their voices in your head?
There was a lot of trial and error, and there were a number of bits that I wrote and that came out subsequently. But I knew that I had to start with Edie, and I wanted to establish the convention of her forgetting. So the same thing happens 3 times at the beginning of the first 3 chapters. She notices the same thing and thinks that she's noticing it for the first time 3 times. So that I knew would establish her and what she was, and then the encounter between them would sort of propel. So I sort of thought of it. Each of my novels I tend to think of in odd structural ways. So this one was like a pair of curtains hanging. So you had the through line of what was happening now was what hung it all, and then there were the loops of the backstory, and that had to have the right balance. But there was a lot of trial and error. So although I wrote that first draft initially very quickly, then there was a lot of adding in and taking out, and a lot of Jonah's Malawi story. I wrote something that I knew approximated to the feeling I wanted, and then I had to go and check my facts and quite dramatically alter that to make it right. Yeah.
You had a question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I found the novel supremely affecting in many ways, and I'm sure everyone has who's read it, and everyone will who hasn't read it yet, but it feels so timely, really interesting to hear that it has had this long, well, as I know, it has had this long genesis. I wondered, this is maybe a slightly playful question, but, you know, the crisis that's depicted beautifully in the novel, maybe on a speculative level, and is now a reality, as we all know. Most of us perhaps live in Kent, we feel very close to what's happening. I wondered, is there anyone that you wish would read this novel, but probably won't?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there was a very nice, one of the lovely blog responses that on the blog tour that Will organised said, this is a novel that every politician should read. I mean, I think the thing is, when you press a book into someone's hand and say, you should read this, you sort of kill it. It takes the joy out of the book. I think must read, one of the most poisonous things you can say about a book is say it's a must read. Because as soon as that sense of worthiness lands on something, or duty, then the joy is gone. So, of course, I'd love everyone to read my book. I'd love, but I think stories work best by stealth. I like it when people are surprised. They pick up the book and they get more than they bargained for, or they get sort of. Stories can be, people will lower their guard, and you know, and what's so magic about fiction, and why I think it is important to write stories and not just report the facts, is that people actually let down their guard more for fiction than they do for facts. So it's, in fact, in Reading the World, I talk about this. There's an academic in the States, Suzanne Brown, who did a study with her students, and she presented them with 3 different kinds of writing: a 419 scam email, a letter from a real-life school child in Botswana who was in need and was asking for help, and then an extract from Alexander McCall Smith's one of his Botswana novels depicting someone in crisis. And the students responded most positively and most empathically to the novel. Mm-hmm. And I think that's because when you're presented, and I'm sure part of it is the strength of the writing, but I think it's also because when you're presented with fiction, no one is directly asking you to do anything. No one's saying you must do this. There's no chugger in front of you holding out their hand. There's no one asking to borrow your car or come and live in your house. And so actually you don't feel like you have to be on the watch for someone trying to take advantage of you or get something from you. And so actually, paradoxically, it makes you more inclined. A friend of mine, Juliette Jilts Romero, who's the writer in residence at the National Theatre at the moment, she used to be a journalist for the BBC, and her first play, the title of which escapes me right now, was about a news story that she encountered where a number of student teachers had been murdered in Mexico, suspected by a drug cartel. And this story gripped her, and the RSC asked if she would like to turn it into a play, so she went and researched it and wrote this play. And she was amazed by the response. The audience, there were huge numbers of people signing up to Amnesty International afterwards, in a way that she never had such a response to her journalism. And she saw from this that actually it's something about actually entering into something without feeling that it's going to be a criticism or a challenge to you, enables you to feel the reality of it more and change more. So I think if I gave it to someone saying you should read this, I've probably already sort of shot it dead. But I like the question. Don't know. Sally might be the best person to say who should read it. I don't know.
A couple more questions. There's one here.
I'll be quick. Was there any point at which you felt inhibited writing the Jonah character, given the debates about cultural appropriation? I know the third person is kind of a solution. Did you ever consider writing him in the first person, or would you discount that out of hand?
I thought for a long time I doubted whether I should try this, and I thought very carefully about it. And this was a long time before many of the debates that we've had about authenticity in recent years. I did feel that I never thought that I would write in the first person, because I felt for me that was a line I couldn't cross, although another writer might well be able to do that. I just felt it wasn't in my skill set. But I think it's really important, and I read a lot of writers on this. I think it's really important that writers of all backgrounds are able to write wherever their stories take them. And that needs to be done thoughtfully and sensitively, particularly when you're writing from a historically dominant culture as I was. But it's actually a trap if you say that writers can only write what's authentic to them. It's a trap for everyone, and in fact it's a trap for writers. I know many writers, Black British writers for example, who are being pigeonholed into writing urban, gritty stories, because that is what their white publishers see as being authentic and will sell authentic to those voices. So if anyone is kind of required to stay in their lane, it actually gets away from what fiction actually is, which is an imaginative experiment, an attempt to engage with human experience and to build bridges, I think. And I was also struck, I mean, a lot of the reading I've done, I read Renée Delodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and actually that prompted me to think that I should do this, because I felt that what I saw in that book, and also in other books like The Good Immigrant, was people saying how part of the problem is that this constant sort of shoehorning of experience, of stereotyping, of kind of presenting characters that are very narrow. And I thought, well, I want to present a character who I hope is every bit as nuanced and real as every other character I create. So that was what I felt I needed to do. But yeah, there will be some people who will think it's not the right choice, but I felt I needed.
Have you had any pushback?
I'm not yet, actually, not
I
yet.
think you carry it off pretty well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there a last question, or should we move to the signing? I just want to say it's also got hope and humour in it, which I didn't expect, and I think the end has got a real lift as well. So thank you, it's fantastic.
Thank
We're going
you.
to sit you down there
Okay.
to sign. As I say, we're selling either book for half price, because this is a good cause and a good book as well. Thank you all for coming. You never know if anyone's going to turn up for these things, and these are always more interesting than these big shenanigans like Eye of Kwang, which is sold out, which I'm sure will be great. But thank you very much.
Thank you.